Chris, I want to start by talking about what we now know today. Tariff threats for one thing. Those tariffs are now in effect, at least for aluminum and steel, which has, I'm sure, a lot of people who were worried beforehand now really worried about what happens, let's say, with respect to a job, for example, or home prices if they want to sell or move. So let's start with that. Let's say your business is directly affected. What should you know about tariffs in your job? What if you're laid off, for example, or you end up in what's called a work sharing program? What do you do next?
Right. So, you said some really key points there about if your company is directly impacted or not. But what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing and some of the discussions we're having is that companies, if your company does business and is not directly impacted by tariffs, well, you might have customers that buy from you that might be, and there might be at risk for defaulting on their payments to you. So there's a lot of ripple effect when you have these tariffs come in and you change the rules of how things are going. If you add 25% to your cost at any level, it has a substantial impact. So what I'm seeing and what we're hearing is, and this is not just small companies and medium companies. You've seen the big banks in Canada. They've increased all of their provisions for credit losses. They're preparing. They're storing money. They're preparing for what they believe to be a lot of defaults on lending and credit lines and mortgages. So that's what they're preparing for. Whether it's going to come to fruition or not, no one knows, but they're preparing for it. And what companies are also doing is they're preparing to try and get leaner through these tough times, not necessarily just because it costs more for them to bring something in from the States or because they might lose out on potential sales to the U.S., but what they're seeing is the business community in general, people that they deal with on a day-to-day basis, they might have a hard time. And if they have a hard time paying their bills, well, that indirectly affects companies. So we're seeing, the federal government is coming out with a whole bunch of programs, like you mentioned, the work sharing program. This is where a company says, you know what, I don't want to lay off my employees, but I don't have enough work for them to do the 40-hour work week. If I take a group in a department, let's say my marketing department, and I have 5 employees there, well, what I'll do is I'll give them 60% of their work, and then the other 2 will get subsidies from the government as if they were on unemployment. So there's new programs coming out, and there's new subsidies coming out to help companies. But if you are an employee at a company right now and you're worried about things, just understand that there is a lot of moving parts, and you might have to sit down with HR and you might have a conversation about, how stable your job is and what they're looking at. So that's not something you should be worried about. You should, actively be involved in those discussions, but it's possible that it will come. Companies are trying to not necessarily just become a solvent or insolvent, but they're trying to prepare themselves for a tough time. And that means maybe reducing their overhead and maybe becoming a little bit leaner, not necessarily because they're losing money, but they want to be able to weather the storm. And so they're making those decisions.
Yeah, I should point out, we had the employment minister, Steve McKinnon, I think, on earlier in the week, talking about these government programs that are now being set up to deal with these eventualities. So you should obviously be aware of that, or I'm sure your employer would be aware of that, because there's a backstop here for people who are going to be affected.
There absolutely is. And, many of these programs that are there, first of all, sometimes the impact from tariffs are so substantial that a company doesn't have enough time to be able to go through the process of securing these programs. So, they have to be implemented quickly. But that being said, if you are, talking to this person right now, they're in their car, maybe driving, just know that there are programs and companies are looking at them, and it's not necessarily black or white where we have to let you go or we have to keep you. There are some gray zones where companies can combine with subsidies from the government to keep people on board and weather the storm.
So let me move from that to the issue of homes. So we had interest rates. We had the Bank of Canada today, again, cut rates. We're 2.75 today, which I guess for a lot of people might inspire them to get back into the housing market. So I know I can't ask you if it's a good time or bad time, but if that's something you're considering, what's the suggestion here?
Right. So from a legal perspective, because I really hope people understand, anytime you have volatility in the housing market, so I read a report where homes between a certain price, I think it was like 400 and 700, people are actively searching those homes, and there's multiple bids on those homes already. probably because they want to maybe downsize a little bit to try and deal with the new economic circumstances. But anytime you have volatility, you have interest rates dropping fast and furious. They say we're going to be, the Bank of Canada is going to be at maybe 2% before the end of the year. There's a lot of cuts coming, and there's a lot of inventory, and people are looking to sell. And when you have volatility, you have to be very careful that you don't act too quickly and get swept up with the hype. So what I mean by that is, if you are a seller, understand, when you have multiple bids, I know it seems like a happy time, but you want as much as possible to be able to screen and weed out the right buyer. And how do you do that? Well, it takes a lot of information sharing, not just on what your home is like, but who the buyers are, what their situation is, what their financial situation is. It's important to know as much as possible when you try to go through with some of these bids, because like I said, if you're a buyer, on the other hand, concede too much to try and be the winning bid and forget that you're making a massive purchase, and you want to make sure that doesn't come back to bite you. So what I tell everyone is, the more volatile it is, the more hype there is, the more change there is. That's even more important for you to make sure that you stay grounded and that you cross all your T's and dot all your I's, because that's where mistakes usually happen. When there's when housing is down and it's cold and prices are stagnant, there's no rush. People have time to make nice, clear decisions. There's no rush, and we see less of these things. But again, my advice is, if you're going to go into the market now and you're seeing already that there's increase in offers and there's 3 or 4 or 5 bidders on a house, be very careful. Not that you don't want to continue, but be very careful about what you're leaving on a table, because you want to be the winning bid. I wouldn't leave too much on the table, that's for sure.
Which is interesting. The irony, I guess, is, right, you have lower interest rates, which would typically spur a housing market, but at the same time, we're facing these tariffs, and there's a tremendous gray area out there. So I wonder if those people who ordinarily would be taking advantage of lower rates are sitting back and saying, wait a sec, before we commit to anything, let's kind of wait and see how this plays out, because it could have a huge impact.
It can definitely have a huge impact. And, you talk about interest rates. So the price, people always look at what their monthly payment is. So a rate goes down, monthly payment goes down. But usually there's a give and take. The more the rates drop, the more prices go up. So it's not necessarily the case where, because my interest rate is lower, well, then my payments can be lower, because you have to consider both. But to your point, there's a lot that can happen. And whatever the situation is today could be different 6 months from now. I'm not trying to, persuade everyone to stay out of the housing market.
But that's the reality, right?
Right.
Yeah.
You just have to understand risk. And risk is something that you have to put a dollar value on. And the more risk you take, well, the better price you should get. And the less risk you take, well, you're probably prepared to pay a little more money because it's low risk. But you have to put a dollar value to risk.
We will leave it at that. Chris, thank you so much. I appreciate it.